And we are live. And we are live. And we are live. Hello everybody, I am Haunted Mind and welcome back to another Minecraft Plasma Paradigm Minecraft live stream in which I'm going to be continuing once again to expand upon and build this big city project that I am doing in these live stream projects. Or rather live streams, should I say. Last time we built this mock-up kind of tree farm to get myself going in the world for certain resources and things like that. Today I'm going to improve this, where is it? Not that page, I'm skipping a page in my book, I think. Am I? Nope, I was on the wrong page anyway in my notebook. But I shall be improving this tree farm a bit today, as well as maybe making a sludge boiler, mapping out spawn chunks today, which is going to be the big one, and then putting in some birch trees into this farm as well. Because I would like birch trees for a certain part of what I have planned for this. So first thing I am looking for today is copper, which I already have in my inventory, thankfully. So then with what I have highlighted in my notebook and testing world for this ongoing project, which I am not seeing here. Am I just being blind? There we go, that's it. I am wanting one of these to harvest more of the trees at my farm today, or wanting to implement that, and specifically a copper one, because that is what I have highlighted as needing for the tree farm design for this world. Do I have any plastic? I do, but that is not quite enough, unfortunately. I don't do that. And since my last stream, I did leave my computer on a slight bit after the previous live stream, whilst I was clearing up IRL after it, just to get a few more trees grown and stuff like that. But I don't really plan to do any major AFKing bit in this world at the moment. Anyway, maybe in the future, but I think for now I would just kind of like to focus on doing things on camera and what have you, because these days in Minecraft with massive projects and what have you, always seems to be kind of a thing about is it faked or not. To me it would seem like I've heard a lot of controversies around the hardcore live streamers being fake, or not necessarily all of them, but some of them. But yeah, what am I looking for? Don't think I've got any bone meal for this, so I think I am just going to have to go find another rubber tree, or just take one from here and smelt down this rubber. Just quickly pop that in here. Is this configured correctly? It is. Why are you not active without signal? There we go. So last time, where I ended off with my waffling as I do in these live streams, I was talking about the author M.R. James, who is one of my favourite authors of all time. Old English ghost stories author, he is known for, and I came to his stories thanks to various television adaptations of his, mainly as a part of what is my favourite TV series of all time, A Ghost Story for Christmas by the BBC. In his lifetime he published, that's going now, that's good. He published 4 collection works of his ghost stories, which he wrote in spare time and as hobbies, primarily. And it wasn't until he apparently never had any intentions of publishing his ghost stories as books and what have you. But after some encouragements from his friends, namely somebody called James McBride, from what I have watched, who illustrated 4 of the ghost stories from his first collection, or for his first collection rather, which was Ghost Stories of an Antiquary in, just looking at my phone, 1904 it came out. And where we left off last time in terms of my discussions and what have you about M.R. James and his ghost stories and what have you, was with me getting partway through the first collection of ghost stories by him, which was Ghost Stories of an Antiquary, published in 1904, of which there was 8 stories published in the book total. So previous video we covered the first 5 of his stories, which were Canon Albrick's Scrapbook, Lost Hearts, the Mezzo-Tint, the Ash Tree, and number 13, or in the previous live stream rather, having not covered the last 3 stories in the collection due for reasons of time and me running out of steam in the last live stream. Do that. Then that's probably also something I needed to do for this world, but I digress. So the next story on the roster of M.R. James stories from A Ghost Story for an Antiquary was, or is, Count Magnus, which is a really interesting and good story. Once again, like all M.R. James stories are, I would have said, from the ones that I have read, as I have not read all of his stories. I've only just recently come to them in more recent years of myself having been a fan of primarily the television works of his television adaptations of his works rather. Pardon me. And Count Magnus is one that I so happen to have read only once, I think. No, I would have read this one twice actually, but I would be more familiar with the 2021 TV film that was a adaptation of it by Mark Gatiss. The basic story to Count Magnus is this, what's he called? This is about to start. This guy basically comes to this certain place in Scandinavia, if I remember correctly, who is writing a tour guide for the place, and hears of these whisperings of a particular Count Magnus, who is a kind of iconic and famous count of the local area. And as he kind of curiously pokes and prods more and more into particular things to do with the Count, he starts to find that the Count was known for some sinister things, and the ghost story in turn kind of plays out like so. From my various inspections and readings into kind of the Ghost Story for Christmas TV series, it is known that the director of those films originally in the 70s, Lawrence Gordon Clark, wanted to do a adaptation of this story, Count Magnus, but the BBC wouldn't throw the budget at him, or throw the production team the needed money in order to the necessary amount of money that it would require to make Count Magnus. So I think as such the slot for that episode that Count Magnus would have been in the original run was then filled up by the Charles Dickens adaptation of The Signalman. And then after that, from my reading of the BFI Blu-ray booklet of the release of the second half of Ghost Stories for Christmas on Blu-ray by the BFI, Lawrence Gordon Clark then wanted to film Count Magnus, number 13 after after The Signalman, apparently, to go back to the M.R. James stuff. But again, that never happened. And then the BBC, or whoever was in charge of the series, in conjunction with Lawrence Gordon Clark, decided to do a couple original scripts which weren't very well received, or as well received as the other films in the series, particularly the second of these, The Ice House, which is one thing that I do agree with, that isn't particularly good or noteworthy. But what's interesting about Count Magnus and what have you was that it eventually got adapted in 2021 by Mark Gatiss, which is really interesting, I would have said, because I believe Lawrence really did want the adaptation of Magnus to happen. So the fact that it eventually did get made by Mark in the revived run of A Ghost Story for Christmas is pretty interesting and cool, I would have said. And I don't know how Lawrence, or what Lawrence thought of the Mark Gatiss film. I'm assuming he has seen it. But as for myself, I personally do really enjoy the film adaptation that we do have of it, courtesy of Mark Gatiss and co. That came out in 2021. But I do personally think it isn't the best film in the entire series, or a particular standout from the Mark Gatiss stuff, but it is one of his better ones at the same time, as I do find the Mark Gatiss films to be quite hit or miss whenever it comes to A Ghost Story for Christmas. Whenever I last watched this series and what have you, I really didn't like his original story, The Dead Room. That one just kind of rubbed me the wrong way, and I really didn't enjoy that one personally. So I don't particularly like that one, and the other one that I don't particularly like was Martin's Close, which is probably another one we'll get onto at some point within my live stream, and various wafflings about ghost stories and what have you that I enjoy doing. Let's see. But as for the main film itself, which I have done a review for within my documentary on the revived era of A Ghost Story for Christmas, I really did enjoy this film for the most part, I would have said. I think in some areas it can be really creepy and very well written, like just like the description, for example, of the face being sucked away from a man, just leaving flesh and bone behind, just kind of a bloodied mess. and that's being the description of how the Phantom attacks people, is just absolutely fantastic and very chilling. That was, if I recall correctly, in the original printed story as well. But it's obviously worth noting that it makes its way into the adaptation here as well. Just to show how kind of Mark Gatiss did the adaptation and how well he did it. How well he did it, obviously being quite subjective and what have you, but generally speaking, I think he did a really good adaptation of the original source story, that is Count Magnus. Now, whereas I do enjoy the film, definitely, and would say it is a good one by Mark Gatiss, at the same time, I do have my issues with it, and I will say that it isn't the absolute best of the Mark Gatiss films. Whenever I did a full kind of review of it and what have you for my documentary video Tractate Warnings back in, which was released in February 2023, at the time I was quite foggy on the kind of motivations of ℬ𝓊𝓇𝒾ℯ𝒹, who's our main character and the tour guide that does the book and what have you, all the writings that I mentioned earlier. I was a little kind of foggy on his kind of motivations and what have you, like what his purposes were and what have you. Like, why is he here? Why is he doing these writings and what have you? It really kind of like his motivations in that particular sense wasn't very well transcribed to me at the time. I had watched the episode for that documentary, and at that point I had actually watched the episode twice. So if that's a poor bit of information conveying by Mark, I do not know. I maybe have to go back and watch the film for a fourth time overall to kind of see if I can grasp it a bit better. But now, having read the original story a couple times now, I do feel like I do have a better grip on ℬ𝓊𝓇𝒾ℯ𝒹's motivations in the episode, thanks to the better written in that sense original story by M.R. James, as ℬ𝓬𝓁's kind of purposes in the story and what have you were much better conveyed in that than in the adaptation by Mark Gatiss. So I probably am able to enjoy the episode a bit more now, having read the original story and then in turn having a grip on the plot and motivations by ℬ𝓬𝓁 a bit more now, with them being more well written in the original story. So I think that's going to help enhance and enrich my further viewings of the episode, which I will still do, because I do think it is a solid kind of 7 out of 10 type of ghost story, but with flaws like that one, like that possible one as I mentioned. The other issue I had with it was that it was a bit overstated in its scares sometimes, and its horror aspect, I would have said sometimes. Like with the previously mentioned face being stripped away down to like the flesh and bone stuff, that makes it into the adaptation, as I mentioned, but which is conveyed in a kind of good pub scene and what have you, where ℬ𝓊𝓇𝒾ℯ𝒹 is asking a local about Count Magnus, and this local granting him a mere singular story of Count Magnus, because of the locals' own superstitions about Magnus and what have you. So that bit of the face being stripped away from the flesh is mentioned by this individual in this particular scene, and then right after he gives this very vivid and graphic depiction of this victim of the ghost, the episode, for whatever reason, feels the need to jump scare us and actually showcase to us visually what actually happened to this person, whereas I feel like it would have been much better just to leave what happened to the person as just the description given by this local character that ℬ𝓊𝓇𝒾ℯ𝒹 was speaking to. I just feel like that would have been much better to leave it at that, because it would have been more scary in a way, I think, to kind of think about the implications of what this character has said, rather than just being shown to us exactly what happened. Like, we can't envision for ourselves what this fatality, so to speak, looks like in our heads. Is there bits of skin hanging off? How clean stripped away was this person of their face, you know? I feel like just jump scaring us with how it actually how it actually happened just diminishes the impact as well of the scary aspect of this part, I would have said. And it just gives an unnecessary jump scare that's just kind of pathetic, to be honest, and it is one kind of gripe with it that I kind of have sometimes with Mark Gatiss stuff. I think most exemplary in this one, but there are kind of other moments in his stories or in his adaptations and what have you that are a bit like this as well, like the ending to the ℰ𝓎ℯ𝓇, for example. I think I probably mentioned that in my last stream, of how it just kind of goes on for a bit too long, and how it could have just ended like a few seconds sooner. This one's kind of slightly different, but kind of same kind of principle, in that I think it could have done with some slight trimming and more restraint in Mark Gatiss's script for it to be better than it is. Like, in of itself, it's a very good ghost story piece of television generally, but with some more restraint and Mark Gatiss's script here and there, so to speak, like with this particular scene, I feel like it could have been even better than what we got. But what we got is still a pretty solid piece of ghost story television, and is one that I will come back to. Not the best in the overall run of 19-20 episodes, but a very good one at that, even though I think the script could show more restraint. But it's cool that it happened, and I really did enjoy it for what it is. And it's cool that it happened, especially given how Lawrence Gordon Clark wanted a adaptation to happen in the 70s, and forgot to mention an interesting kind of artifact of that to finally circle back inwards to it. Is that a draft script by a screenwriter called Basil Copper for this ultimately unmade 70s adaptation still does exist, and was published in a book of own ghost stories by Clark in 2013. Which is one kind of book I would like to obtain for the collection at some point, but one I've not been able to obtain as of yet. Then, after Count Magnus in the original book of ghost stories of an antiquary, we have one of the big ones with regards to M.R. James's ghost stories, and that is "Oh Whistle and I Will Come to You, My Lad." Basically, the premise to this story is a Professor Parkins is gone off on holiday with one of his friends, to my memory, and he stays on longer than this friend, if I recall correctly, and he is asked by this friend to have a look at some certain ruins and what have you atop a hill on these sand dunes that are at the, I believe, Cornish or Anglian location that the story is. I think it is Cornwall for this one, and I think the Anglian one that I'm thinking of was A Warning to the Curious, but I digress. And atop these sand dunes he does some digging and finds this strange looking cylindrical metal object, which is actually, as you would expect from the story title, a whistle. He blows into it, and lo and behold, he unleashes the force of a malevolent supernatural entity into the world, and that plagues him through the duration of the story. And it's an absolute classic, this ghost story by M.R. James. It's absolutely fantastic, and is easily one of my absolute favourites by the author, which is probably cliche to say at this point, but it is what it is. It's an incredible and very chilling little ghost story. That went well. There we go. But yes, "Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad" is an absolute classic of the ghost story, and without realising how long my previous stream was going to go on for, I decided to title that earlier stream, or that previous live stream, after a quotation from the story. which is the ghost being described as having a face of crumpled linen, which is a very terrifying description, I would have said, and is absolutely fantastic. As I would have detailed in other live streams and what have you earlier to this one, there were 4 adaptations of M.R. James stories back in the 1960s, which were or earlier ones, which were the adaptations from the TV series Mystery and Imagination, which are all unfortunately lost, with no copies known to exist, quite sadly. And there's Daleks in the Nether. I wasn't expecting that. Again, this Dalek mod is quite new to me. But yeah, whereas we don't unfortunately have those 1960s adaptations of M.R. James in the archives, we do have another 1960s adaptation of M.R. James that came after the Mystery and Imagination ones, which was a 1968 adaptation of "Oh Whistle and I Will Come to You, My Lad," which came out the same year, slightly later on, as the Mystery and Imagination adaptation of Casting the Runes. It was produced as a part of the documentary series by the BBC called Omnibus, which was, as I said, more known for having done, or more known for doing documentaries and what have you, rather than original works of fiction and what have you. So them doing a ghost story as a part of this series was quite unusual. But nonetheless, despite how unusual it was, how do I create a waypoint here? Whatever. It's kind of off in that direction. Right. Despite how unusual it was for them to create a piece of fiction television for the series, which was more known for documentaries and what have you, it was still critically acclaimed and is still quite well received to this day by fans of ghost story television and M.R. James enthusiasts, although it is one that is quite eccentric in its presentation and what have you, in various ways and means. Like the character of Parkins in this adaptation is very different and what have you to the original story. Like, I think it was suggested in the original perhaps that he was perhaps not quite all there in the head, to, I think, put it in the nicest way as I can. Why did I say that? No Nether Fortress. Okay. Right. Is there any more over here? Nope, doesn't look like it. I will find one eventually. But whereas the original story kind of did imply that he wasn't 100% altogether mentally, I think, to my recollection. I could be wrong about that. I'm not an expert on M.R. James. I'm just very passionate about his stories and the TV adaptations of his. And as I said, Ghost Story for Christmas is my favourite TV series of all time. So I'm not an expert on M.R. James, but I do distinctly hold kind of a passion for him and what have you. But either ways, I digress. The adaptation of O Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, here in 1968 by Jonathan Miller is a fantastic and at times very creepy adaptation of the story. Partway through the story, Parkins is sleeping in bed. This obviously being after he has found the whistle and has blown into it. There's this scene in this story where Parkins is having a nightmare, basically, and which kind of showcases him being chased along a beach by this phantom figure. And the way it's done and adapted in this story and what have you and the way it's adapted in this television episode is absolutely fantastic. I would have said I have already lost my way to the portal. That is great. Well, here we are. But how it's done in the original, how it's done in this TV version is absolutely fantastic, I would have said, and is extremely creepy. And with it being kind of probably quite a low budget adaptation and what have you, that was kind of done economically in terms of price and what have you, it's obviously not got big fancy special effects to it or anything like that, so how it's realised is quite simple, but at the same time it's brilliantly realised with how it's done, with Parkins, as played by Michael Hordern, kind of running away from this fluttering kind of white sheet suspended on a wire behind him. And you can, like, I guess to some people you can kind of point at it and say how it's kind of a bit of a primitive piece of special effects work by the BBC, but for me I find it to be very effective at showing the ghost, I would have said. And it's really creepy and just brilliantly realised, this particular scene, as is the rest of this ghost story, as is the rest of this story by M.R. James in this particular version of it, as done by Jonathan Miller, the director, and the BBC. And I get how some people may not be able to get on board with it and what have you. like it took me a couple watches and what have you to fully kind of get it and what have you, I would have said. But currently I absolutely love it and would have said it is a fantastic adaptation, as it's a bit more of a psychological type of ghost story, I would have said. Let's see here. So there's a lots of, it's like it, as I mentioned earlier, it kind of toys around with Parkins's mental health status much more than it did than the original story by James did, with a lot of scenes of him kind of mumbling to himself being prevalent in this adaptation, and a lot of the episode kind of making the implication or posing the question of, is this ghost real, or is it just a figment of Parkins's imagination? So there's a lot of scenes of him like just eating and what have you in the adaptation, and it can be really random sometimes, and a lot of people may not be able to kind of get on with it and what have you. I would have said because of how psychological this adaptation can be, and just generally how weird it can be. But personally, I think it is an absolutely fantastic adaptation of the story. And one thing that it was something that I was tempted to watch in preparation for this documentary, or not this documentary, this live stream here today. But what I ended up watching actually was a documentary from, I believe, 1996, which was A Pleasant Terror: The Life and Ghosts of M.R. James, which was kind of a documentary and what have you about his general life, and features various contributions from people that kind of knew him and what have you over the years and what have you, like actual people that kind of met him and what have you. Why is my Twitch not... Is my connection still okay? What is happening to my connection? That I'm on YouTube, but YouTube's fine, but is Twitch okay? No, it appears to be... No, I've gone offline on Twitch for some reason. That is unusual. Let me just go back to... Don't know why I went offline on Twitch, but there we go. Same YouTube stream, but not on Twitch for some reason. I don't know why that is, but it appears that I'm streaming back on Twitch now. Good thing I checked that. There we go, and we are back on Twitch by the looks of it, which is good. Don't really know what happened there exactly, but we are back on Twitch, which is good. But yeah, to kind of summarize and what have you, I really did enjoy this 1968 adaptation of, or 1968 adaptation of Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad. Although I can see why some people don't like it or find it a bit hard to get on with because of its very psychological and maybe cerebral. No, I think cerebral is the wrong word, but generally very psychological kind of adaptation and what have you of the story. That's a good one. And what I was mentioning earlier before I got distracted there was talking about the ℬ𝓊𝓇𝒾⯯ the Lives and Ghosts of M.R. James documentary from 1996. Which features contributions from people that knew him in real life, people that were taught by him and what have you, and various people that admired his work and what have you. And it was a very good documentary overall, and I am happy that I watched it, and I'm very happy that I did watch it. It is one thing that I have seen before. I think I've seen it a few times now, but it is really good documentary about M.R. James, I would have said. And there's all sorts of very interesting bits and pieces within it, like the famous horror actor Christopher Lee praising his stories very, very highly and what have you, with him saying that they're so brilliantly written, and that with him saying that they're so brilliantly written that you actually believe them, which is a really interesting thing to hear for me, coming from a horror movie actor that I have loved in various movies and what have you by the likes of Hammer Studios over the years, or the likes of one of my favourite gothic horror movies, The Blood Demon from Germany in the 1960s, which was an adaptation of the Pit and the Pendulum by Edgar Allan Poe, which I think is a fantastic gothic horror movie and easily one of my personal favourite gothic horror movies of all time. So hearing him talking about M.R. James and what have you, one of my favourite authors, in this way is really interesting to hear and what have you. I would have said, or it is rather, and this documentary has all sorts of interesting bits of information in it and what have you, about the life of M.R. James, and interesting kind of words from people that knew James or heavily researched James and what have you, and it was a really interesting, or it is a really interesting watch and what have you, for somebody who has been such a big fan of Mr. James and still is. I believe I watched this once when I got a DVD of it, or a DVD with it on it some years ago, and then I watched it for a second time when I decided to write about it in a documentary video of mine on my Haunted Network YouTube channel, being Casting the Runes Part 2. And earlier today I watched it for a third time and really enjoyed it once again. And there's all sorts of interesting bits of information in it and what have you. Trying to come back round now from this sidetrack rambling into what I kind of brought this up for and what have you. One of the people and what have you that is kind of interviewed about Mr. James in this adaptation and is kind of talked about and what have you, and kind of talks about him within, is Jonathan Miller, the director of this 1968 adaptation of "Oh Whistle and I Will Come to You." And he says a lot of interesting things about the author in this particular documentary, but what really kind of stuck out to me and what have you was that from this watch was him discussing and mentioning his adaptation of "Oh Whistle and I Will Come to You, My Lad," not as a direct medium transcription of the story, so to speak, but instead an essay on the story, which I find a really interesting kind of unique way to look at an adaptation of Mr. James and what have you. I would have said, as Jonathan Miller did, so it's really interesting how he kind of viewed this adaptation of Mr. James and what have you. But yeah, that's I think what I've really got to say on that particular section of this. I can tell myself running out of steam on that. But this wasn't the only television adaptation of "Oh Whistle and I Will Come to You, My Lad," as there was another adaptation in 2010 as a part of the main A Ghost Story for Christmas series, and which starred John Hurt, which at this point had recently been revived back in 2005 by the BBC. And the overall Ghost Story for Christmas series started in 1971 with Lawrence Gordon Clark's first film of Mr. James being an adaptation of the stalls of Barchester Cathedral, and it was, and the 1968 version of "Oh Whistle and I Will Come to You, My Lad" was cited as a inspiration for the films, and I guess you could see can be seen as a unintentional pilot for the series, or unofficial kind of episode 0. for the series in a way, which is really interesting. And yeah, really interesting to kind of see it in that kind of perspective as well. But eventually the BBC, after originally ending the series, decided to relaunch it in the early 2000s with an adaptation of A View from a Hill. Then it got followed up with another episode in 2006 with ℬ𝓊𝓇𝒾ℯ𝒹, 2 episodes that I really like, and I will probably get to A View from a Hill at some point, possibly. And I've already probably talked about the ℬ𝓊𝓇𝒾ℯ𝒹 episode at great length in my previous stream already, and what have you. But yeah, those 2 are really good episodes. But then the series kind of hit a stall for a while, and no new episode of the show came out until 2010 with a adaptation of ℜ𝓎ℯ𝓈, this time as a part of the main run and series of A Ghost Story for Christmas. But this time it was directed by somebody called Anthony D'Amoni, if I'm remembering his name right, and it starred John Hurt as Professor Parkins and what have you. And honestly, out of all of the M.R. James adaptations that the series has produced thus far, I think in terms of like an adaptation full stop, this is probably the worst one, I would have said. I try not to like harp on about comparing things very heavily to original source materials and what have you, but even as a piece of ghost story television, I don't find this very good and what have you. And as an adaptation of the M.R. James story, it's just even worse as well, I would have said, with it really just being elementally an adaptation of the original story, I would have said. Let's do that one more time. See. Okay. Be right back. So what I kind of meant by it being elementally just an adaptation of M.R. James was that it kind of took a lot of elements from the original story and what have you, and then kind of transcribed it into this really weird work of television. But I guess that's kind of slightly unfair and what have you, because there is still a fair amount to this adaptation and what have you that has to do with the original story. But at the same time, it's just not a very good adaptation of the story. Like, I can't remember what it is exactly, but even the titular whistle doesn't appear in this story, and it plays more like a story which is dealing with grief rather than how should I say, a ghost story, I would have said, and what have you. Let's see. Do that and that. There is parts of it that are a ghost story and what have you, of course, but it mainly just plays out like it's just a story of grief, and Professor Parkins here in this version is just going through the motions of grief and dealing with the loss of his wife or what have you, or not necessarily the loss of his wife, but dealing with how much he cares about his wife, who is in a care home and what have you and can't look after herself. So I guess the ghost aspect is kind of maybe more metaphorical in a sense. But even then, and what have you, it's still not that good of a ghost story, and I think maybe I'm kind of so not in tune with it or happy with it, because of my appreciation for the original story and what have you, and my kind of adoration with the Jonathan Miller adaptation. But yeah, it's just not very good overall, not a very good adaptation of the story, I would have said, and what have you. And it really could have been done better, I would have said, and this isn't really a good kind of justice done to the original story, and it's more like the director or whoever wrote the adaptation here kind of saw this story for being used as a vehicle for a piece of television about grief, I would have said. But yeah, overall it's not a very good adaptation. John Hurt does a good performance in it, but generally speaking, I'm not a fan of this adaptation of the story, I would have said, and generally speaking it is the kind of worst adaptation, I would have said, in terms of an M.R. James story and what have you. Just really don't like it that much overall, and it's quite divisive as well, as I would have said, in the kind of M.R. James fan base. Some people like it. I used to like it at one point, but now it's just kind of soured on me, I would have said. Like, but nonetheless, I absolutely love the original story that it is based on, and I do also absolutely love the 1968 adaptation with Michael Hordern, and with it being done by Jonathan Miller and what have you. This isn't going well. This is not much luck here for me in this. Maybe I'm doing it wrong, but I'm going to keep going for a little while. So, ℰ𝓎ℯ𝓈 was the penultimate story in M.R. James's Ghost Story for Antiquary book, with the final one being the Treasure of Abbot Thomas, which was adapted as a television film as a part of Ghost Stories for Christmas back in 1974, I believe. Yes, it was 1974, and that is how I found out about the original story. And interestingly, it also got uncredited adaptation wise, but it was adapted as a Dario Argento produced film in the 80s called The Church, but I'll get back to that in a bit. So the original story, like with many of M.R. James's other stories and what have you, showcases a student, similarly like M.R. James's other stories showcases a student kind of studying ancient manuscripts and what have you, and if I recall correctly, his teacher is a character that's kind of involved in the story, and they start to learn about and solve the mystery of this treasure of a certain Abbot Thomas and what have you, and are able to decipher a puzzle effectively left behind by the Abbot Thomas, that points to this treasure and what have you that he has buried and what have you. And as it said in the original story, buried underneath a certain number of eyes and what have you. So they're able to crack and decode this puzzle and are able to find the location of the particular treasure in question, and they're able to find it behind this panel of eyes and what have you. And as soon as they unleash this treasure chest of gold coins and what have you from its burial prison, they unleash this terrifying supernatural force, as you would expect from a typical M.R. James story. The 1976 TV film and what have you that is an adaptation of is again absolutely amazing, like all of the other Lawrence Gordon Clark directed episodes of that series, with the exception of The Ash Tree possibly, and what's it called, Stigma, one of the original scripts from the series. but this is another one that I absolutely love and what have you, and I think it is a fantastic adaptation of the story, and it is one that I have read a couple times now, and is one that I also do really like and what have you. This particular adaptation is very good in terms of its supernatural aspects and what have you, in terms of all of the phantoms and ghosts and what have you that we see in this particular story. And one thing that I believe wasn't in the original printed version of the story but is prevalent here is the student, I forget his name, and I believe his teacher as well, participating in seances by certain friends and what have you that they have. And that's an interesting kind of implication into the main story and what have you. I would have said, in an interesting little addition to the story, I would have said. There's no real supernatural entities or anything like that seen from the seances and what have you, as they're more glimpsed in other parts of the episode, for sure. But it's an interesting kind of addition to the story and what have you, and I think it does kind of fit in nicely into the main kind of narrative and what have you. The main kind of supernatural forces we see in the original story and what have you, or in the adaptation here, is in various kind of indistinct shapes and other unusual supernatural phenomena, which kind of unusual shapes and things of that nature, instead of the usual ghosts and what have you that you would more commonly associate ghost stories with and what have you. Like the eerie transparent figures and what have you, and that was something kind of M.R. James was known for not having typical representations of ghosts in his stories, with the kind of depictions of them and what have you being more kind of fantastical and kind of indistinct in terms of shapes and what have you. Which I find a really interesting way of going about it, and makes his style of doing ghost stories really interesting and unique. And that is shown quite well here in this adaptation of, visually shown in this adaptation of The Treasure of Abbot Thomas, and in other and in the original story as well. It seems like I'm only respawning in 4 select chunks here, which is maybe how the mechanics work, but okay. Maybe I'll just have to build around them or something. Do I one more time here just in case anything changes? No. So I'm assuming that the spawn chunks that I've respawned in are at this kind of center of the spawn chunks or something like that, and the spawn chunks are kind of a ring around it, which would make sense and what have you. So I guess that's just how it works. But the kind of ghosts and what have you that are realised and what have you in the Treasure of Abbot Thomas, particularly in the TV film, for my visual references here. See. Are kind of indistinct shapes and what have you. Kind of seen briefly. Like there's one particular moment where they're investigating the treasure or potential treasure and what have you. And they're at the top of this church and what have you, and you see this kind of weird black shape just kind of flicker past them very quickly. And you don't really see what it is. It's kind of like it's kind of like visualized like the flapping of a bird or something like that, but we're never quite sure exactly as to what it was. See, that's that one. So I'm here. That's that one, right. It's kind of realised like this kind of weird flapping of a bird and what have you, but we're never quite certain exactly as to what it actually was. We're just kind of left to guess at what it was, I guess you could say. But it was a really good way of doing a suggested kind of phantom attacking them, I would have said. I think it might have actually been a bird thinking back on it, but it was an interesting kind of moment in the film where it kind of makes you guess as if they're being attacked by a ghost or not, but obviously they weren't, as I think it was kind of realised that it was a bird and what have you at the end of this particular scene. But the main kind of phantom and what have you that is shown in the episode and what have you is this kind of horrid kind of ball of slime and what have you that kind of creeps and moves after people in the story, which is a really interesting and unique way of going about it, I would have said. See here, it's okay. Just thinking, is this the right space? Yeah. So I've got one here, one here. It's fine. So it's fine. Just build it like that, I guess. But I find that the television adaptation here generally is fantastic and what have you, and I think it is a fantastic little adaptation of the story and is one that I do really like a lot, and it has some very well done and creepy sequences to it, I would have said. one particular scene and what have you that I find really good is them kind of going down and finding the treasure in this kind of dank and claustrophobic tunnel that the episode presents us with. See, that's that one. And I find it a really good scene overall, showing them finding the treasure and then unleashing the supernatural force, because as they break the glass and what have you, or not break the glass but break the panel and what have you of where the treasure is hidden and what have you, this kind of gush of wind happens to them as soon as they break the panel open, thus implying the supernatural force has been unleashed and what have you, which I find a really interesting way of doing it and what have you, and really creative and good way of showing to them that the force has been, or showing to us viewers that the force has indeed been unleashed by these unknowing adventurers. But yes, overall I would have said it's a fantastic adaptation of the original story, and it is one that I definitely do not skip whenever I'd be going through the series. In fact, the only episode in the original run that I would skip is the ice house, I would have said, which I find to be absolutely dreadful. But I don't think many people who watch this series or have seen that episode will blame me for that. But yeah, fantastic little entrance into the series, I would have said, and it is a great ghost story piece of television and a good original story by M.R. James as well. An interesting kind of anomaly and what have you I came across with M.R. James, and researching all of the documentaries and what have you, or researching what adaptations there have been done of him and what have you over the years, led to me finding an interesting anomaly. It would seem that, or it would be that the majority of adaptations of his have been on television, and there's only been one credited film adaptation of a story of his, which is Night of the Demon from 1957, I want to say, directed by Jacques Turner. And that is a very good adaptation of the original story, Casting the Runes. But whenever you're looking at M.R. James and kind of researching him and what have you, it would occasionally or quite often appear that that is the only adaptation of a story of his that there has been done, and that's not actually true. It is the only credited adaptation of a story by him, but from my research and my watches and what have you, it isn't the only movie adaptation of his stories that there has been done, as there is an uncredited adaptation of The Treasure of Abbot Thomas, being the church from 1986, I think, 1986 is check that. It probably won't say on the Wikipedia page that I have for the story pulled up. No, it doesn't mention it at all, but I think it was 1986 that the church came out, which was one in a film trilogy directed by ℬ𝓊𝓯𝒾⯯, if I'm pronouncing his name right, and produced by horror maestro Dario Argento, with the other films in the trilogy being Cemetery Man, and what's the other one called? Forget what the other one's called at the moment. But after making a name for himself in the kind of genre of giallo horror or giallo Italian horror movies, Dario Argento ended up collaborating with ℬ𝓊𝓯𝒾⯯ on these three movies: Cemetery Man, The Church, and whatever the other one is called. I forget what it's called at the moment. In the late 80s, after having made such amazing horror films in the 70s, like Deep Red and Suspiria, the mighty Suspiria, which is an absolutely incredible Italian horror film and one of my favourite horror movies of all time, probably, or I would have said it is one of my favourite horror movies of all time. But this film here, The Church, is in of itself a loose, or is an uncredited adaptation of The Treasure of Abbot Thomas, but I would have said it's definitely has Dario Argento's kind of stamp on it and what have you, and is very much does feel like one of his movies, I would have said. It's that one, and then that one. That's going to be enough, I think. Yes, because that's that distance, right? But Dario Argento is a horror movie maker and what have you that I greatly admire, and is one that I have absolutely fallen in love with over the years, I would have said, and I thoroughly do enjoy his movies. I would have said I'm still quite new to his movies and what have you, but even still, having not seen relatively a lot of them, only 5 of them, Bird of the Crystal Plumage, Deep Red, and Suspiria, Phenomena, which is another one of my absolute favourites by him, and now The Church. I still would have said he is one of my favourite filmmakers of all time, and is a really interesting, unique style of horror filmmaking, I would have said, and which is prevalent in his very neon colours and what have you that he uses throughout his films and what have you, and not to mention the absolutely amazing often progressive rock music that is prevalent in his soundtracks to his movies and what have you. Let's see here. That. And The Church is another entry into the vast kind of catalogue of films by Dario Argento, as he really has done a lot of horror movies to his name and what have you, and this one that came out in 1989 is absolutely amazing for the most part, and is a uncredited adaptation of The Treasure of Abbot Thomas by M.R. James. So the basic kind of plot of this is very similar to the original Treasure of Abbot Thomas story that we were or have already been kind of given and what have you, with the original story by James and the 1974 directed film by Lawrence Gordon Clark and what have you. See, that's that one. But this one definitely has much more of Argento's style, and it is very interesting to kind of see an M.R. James movie that has Dario Argento's style kind of pasted all over it, I would have said. See here. I don't think I really have a lot to say on the church primarily, but I really did enjoy it overall, and it did have a lot of really good kind of creepy moments to it, and there were definitely some moments that were taken from the original M.R. James story. But as an overall movie and what have you, I think it is another really enjoyable slice of Argento fiction and what have you. But I would have said it starts out better than it ended and what have you. It kind of loses steam towards the end, I would have said. Whereas I think it's an absolutely fantastic adaptation of the source material in kind of Argento's visual flair and style and what have you for the most part, and what have you for the first good leg of it and what have you. I feel like at the end of the film it just kind of becomes this big kind of picture gallery of phantasmagorical imagery and what have you, and isn't very cohesive in terms of a story anymore. At this point it really loses its cohesion and what have you. I would have said at this point it really kind of loses the plot, literally. I would have said, and it just kind of devolves into this kind of array of phantasmagorical imagery and what have you, I would have said, at the end of the day. And it could have ended a lot better and what have you, or could have perhaps been better written and what have you, but what was good in the movie was really good and what have you. And it's interesting to see a Dario Argento or M.R. James adaptation in Dario Argento's distinct kind of visual style and what have you. and I would have said that definitely there were some really interesting and good moments to be had within it and what have you. But overall, I don't think it was as good as it started out to be. The start of the movie is absolutely fantastic and has a lot of really impressive kind of typical Dario Argento visual flair to it and what have you. The opening scene with the knights and what have you on this kind of witch hunt and what have you is absolutely fantastic, and is one that seen in the movie that really sticks out quite well to me, I would have said. And the music score by the progressive rock band Goblin that features in a lot of Argento films and what have you. Their score here is in kind of full force and what have you, and is an absolutely amazing score by them once again, I would have said. And that's another bit of the movie that really I did enjoy massively, was the score, the musical score by Goblin, who always, from what I've seen, seem to have delivered an amazing soundtrack to Dario Argento movies and what have you. The movie as well also had some fantastic visual elements to it as well, like the demon and what have you that is shown and what have you throughout the movie. And it's got some absolutely amazing special effects to it and what have you, and some amazing special and practical effects to it that really kind of stick out in your mind and are very memorable, like this massive goat demon and what have you that is featured in the movie. And there's some really interesting bits in it and what have you, and it does kind of, looking at it, whereas it is a bit more goat-like in its kind of appearance, this kind of appearance of this demon in this movie does make me think quite a bit of the demon prop we saw in the earlier M.R. James film adaptation, Night of the Demon and what have you. And I think that was a fantastic prop and what have you for in that film. Let's do that. So now I'm going to start laying down the main base, I would have said, for this massive base that I'm going to be making, and I think this here is probably going to be the best area and what have you to make the entrance or an entrance to it. I have not quite figured out the entrance to it yet, as the design of the base and what have you that I have had in mind and what have you has gone through a few different kind of changes and what have you over time, but this would be the kind of start of the template for this base and what have you. If I do, might as well fill this in with planks whilst I am at it, because all of this is going to be the same wooden plank colour apart from the floor tiles anyway, I would have said, all for the moment, and then there's going to be another layer of blocks above it. I would have said with a kind of a proper kind of floor design pattern to it or something at some point. See here, that. But overall, I would have said that the church by Mikhail Sawavi and Dario Argento is a fantastic adaptation of the story if uncredited, but as I said, it does lose kind of steam and cohesion towards the end. So that's me kind of all caught up and what have you with Ghost Stories of an Antiquary and what have you, and the first publicated collection of M.R. James ghost stories and what have you. And I will probably start talking about his other stories and what have you in more live streams in the future, perhaps. But this one here at the moment is coming to an end, as I do feel like I have run out of steam for this one, which was quite prevalent quite a while ago, I think. But I have kept going as I wanted to kind of get this basic bit and what have you of the template and what have you of my main base here down, I would have said, or at least a start of it, which I will probably talk about more in my next live stream and what have you, which won't be next week, as I am preparing to go on, as I will be preparing to go on holiday that night, so I won't be able to live stream, but hopefully on the stream on the week afterwards I will be able to live stream again, and I should be able to. So I'll probably start expanding more this space and what have you in that live stream, and kind of start generally talking about my ideas and what have you for this base, and kind of laying out the kind of general foundations of it and what have you, and start talking about my layout for this base and what have you. But despite my commentary and what have you not going very well in this live stream overall, would have said that's something I probably need to improve upon in terms of live streams and what have you. But generally speaking, I think the progress I've made in the world today has been really good. The spawn chunk mapping didn't go quite as planned, but I think I definitely have enough laid out and what have you to start making my base and what have you. And it would seem like that when you respawn in the spawn chunks, it only spawns you in a select center 4x4 square of them. So I'm assuming that there's a ring of chunks around those four and what have you that around those four that I spawned in or respawned in when chunk mapping and what have you, that those are part of the spawn chunks as well. As you see, I'm not going to need a very big area of the spawn chunks. I believe the spawn chunks are a lot bigger than this, but this is all I'm going to need for my main base and what have you, as I will kind of detail and further explain more in future live streams and what have you, and hopefully by then I will have find ways of improving my commentary and what have you, which is something I want to do in this series and what have you. and just kind of generally find ways to improve my streaming capabilities and what have you, as I don't think this stream today has gone particularly well in terms of commentaries in select parts of it, but very generally speaking, in terms of the progress and what have you that I have made in the world here today, I think it has gone very well generally and what have you, and it's great to be able to kind of set down and what have you these spawn chunks and what have you for this world, as soon my kind of ideas for this world are going to start coming into show and what have you, which is great for only the 4th stream in this series, and with how little progress I kind of made in the 1st stream, I would have said. So it's very good to have all of this progress made and what have you, I would have said. But yeah, I think I'm going to wrap up this stream here. As I said, there won't be a stream next week as I will be preparing to go on holiday and I'm not going to have time to do live streaming. But after that, I will, after that next week, I should be live streaming again at my usual time on my usual day. And hopefully by then there will be a few more kind of features and what have you updated to my Twitch and to my YouTube channel, hopefully. Got loads of plans and loads of ideas of what I want to do for this streaming stuff generally, but it's just a matter of time for all of those to be implemented, like a VR furry avatar, for example. I want to implement into the streams eventually and what have you, but that's going to take some time and research and what have you, but I think at this point I'm kind of stretching this on and what have you and need to end it here. So as I said, there won't be a stream next week, but hopefully there will be one the week afterwards. So yeah, so like, ℬ𝓊𝓇𝒾⯯ subscribe. I hope you guys enjoyed this Minecraft live stream. My commentary could have been better today, but generally speaking, in terms of the progress we have made with the world and what have you, I'm very happy with that progress that we have made, and I'm finally and quite quickly, generally speaking, starting to lay down my general plans for this world and the kind of main spawn chunk area, base and what have you, I would have said, and can't wait to show my ideas for this series and what I will be implementing into this world, with a lot of this space here and what have you being taken over and what have you. Do have plans for these kind of hills and what have you, I would have said, and probably up here as well, all around kind of this main area and what have you. But as I said, there won't be a stream next week, but hopefully there will be a video instead next week displaying a redstone device that I will be making in this world. But yeah, like, ℬ𝓊𝓇𝒾⯯ subscribe. I hope whoever the hell is watching this waffling enjoyed this Minecraft live stream. So yeah, like, ℬ𝓊𝓇𝒾⯯ subscribe. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.